بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So welcome back to our penultimate lecture in this module, inshallah. We are making our way through the list of Masalik al-Illa, the pathways to the Illa. We did 1 through 4 in the previous lectures. Today we're going to do number 5 because it's such a large one. So the whole lecture will be dedicated to number 5, which is called al-Munasaba, appropriability. So, how do we understand that the illah is appropriate to the hukum, to the sharia ruling? That's what this lecture is going to, or this lecture and then this section is going to discuss. In this regard, we are going to learn that there is a difference of level of appropriability. So some links, some appropriability will be obligatory, some of necessary daruri, some of them will be a need, a haja, and some of them will be extra tahseen. And we are going to give examples for all of those kinds. So not every type of link or not every type of appropriability is necessary, and therefore that will determine because obviously not all rulings are obligatory. So if not all rulings are obligatory, then that means that we would understand that some rulings that are not obligatory, that might be necessary or important in life, or mandub or mubah, to use the language of the sharia, likewise it will follow that type of appropriability. And then we are going to learn about the 4 types of appropriateness. In this regards, we will use the Arabic terms, the mu'thir, the mula'im, the gharib, and the mursal. The mursal is the one that's typically rejected by most of the scholars but affirmed by some, so we'll talk about that. And then we will talk about maslaha, or the general good, and how it can be used, and some of the limits for the general good. So those are like the main points that we're going to talk about, but it's going to be heavy. I think this lecture will be more heavy in examples so that you can make sense of the text as we read it. Anyway, that's the game plan for today, and inshallah I look forward to beginning the discussion in the next clip. So we begin the way we normally begin, to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. Al-Khamisu al-Munasaba. So this is the 5th of the pathways of the illah, appropriability, al-Munasaba. So he says, رحمه الله ويسمى استخراجها تخريج المناط. What is concluded by this process, what is concluded by appropriability, is called تخريج المناط. وهو تعيين العلة بابتداء مناسبة مع الاقتران بينهما كالإسكار. تخريج المناط is to specify the ratio legis by highlighting its appropriability to its ruling, like in the case of intoxication. So we have the hadith in Muslim, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, كل مسكر حرام. Every type of intoxicating beverage is impermissible. So it is that text tells us that all types of intoxication are haram. Why is it haram? We said before that the ratio legis, or the illah, is that it clouds the judgment. And we are universally required by Islam, by our religious tradition, to preserve the aql. We'll talk about the maqasid of the sharia shortly. So therefore, this specifies the ratio legis. We have specified it, which is the iskar, and we have made it appropriate. We have linked it in an appropriate way, in a munasib way, to the text, which is every intoxicating drink is haram. So that's a general rule. Every intoxicating drink is haram. What is the illah that revolves around that all the time? Because the illah sticks with the ruling all the time. It is that it intoxicates. So we call that takhrij al-manat. ويحقق استقلال الوصف بعدم غيره بالصبر. What is appropriate Sorry, wrong line. The independent nature of the ratio legis is established by there not being another kind through the process of classification. So in this case, we have to do the process of a sabr, the classification. In this place, you can't say, the mujtahid can say, I searched and I couldn't find it. No, this is not appropriate in this. This is not appropriate in the issue of appropriability. So you have to actually search and find, catalog, and then when you find no other kind, you've established that this is the ratio legis for the ruling, and it's an independent ratio legis. والمناسب وصف ظاهر منضبط يحصل عقلا من ترتيب الحكم عليه ما يصلح كونه مقصودا للشارع من حصول مصلحة أو دفع مفسدة. What is appropriate is a clear defined description which allows the intellect to establish the ruling which is the goal of the Sharia, to established for benefit or to ward off harm. So in this pathway of the illah, in this pathway of the ratio legis, to identify and establish a ratio legis in appropriability, we have to find an illah and we have to be able to define it. It has to be defined and described. Again, if you can't articulate it, then you probably have not found it. So this is sort of kind of reminding ourselves of the importance of logic. One of the things that we learn in Islamic logic is al-had. You know, how do you appropriately, al-had is a definition. So a definition is, you know, jama' muttarid. It brings together all of the necessary qualities and then it excludes everything out from it. So there's a process of how you can come to a proper definition. So, you know, this pen, you could say it's a writing instrument that has ink that is red, or plastics, you know, those type of things, which would, so it's a ballpoint pen, or it's a, I think this is a ballpoint pen, you know, and it says 0.5 millimeters. So the more description that you have, you're excluding the non-0.5 millimeters. You're excluding a dip pen, a fountain pen, an ink pen. You're just excluding a blue pen, a black pen. So you exclude. So the same, I'm just sort of going on a tangent, but the same thing with the illah. You have to be able to describe it. So he says, just to repeat, what is appropriate is a clear, defined description. Why? It allows the intellect to establish the ruling. So, I understand iskar. I understand the illah of clouding the judgment is linked to the ruling of iskar. So I can now make that link. We make the link so well that sometimes when we say it's a muskir, it's an intoxicant, we are basically saying both in the same sentence. So when I say it's muskir, implied in that is that it causes clouding of the judgment, which is haram. So it allows the intellect to establish the ruling, which is what is the ruling? Well, the Sharia has a goal in its ruling. It's either to benefit or to ward off harm. فإن كان الوصف خفيا أو غير منضبط اعتبر ملازمه وهو المظنة. If the description is hidden and not well defined, its connection is assumed and therefore partial. Okay, so now we have weakened the appropriability. Sometimes it's a dhan, and that's why most of fiqh, most of Islamic law is based on dhan, it's not based on yaqeen. Which is why we have differences of opinion and we are able to follow different opinions in different situations. So if the description is hidden and not well defined, one of the byproducts of that is that this connection that we've established, the appropriability we have established, is assumed. It's not yaqeen, it's an assumption, and therefore the link that we've done, the appropriability, is partial. وحصول المقصود من شرع الحكم قد يكون يقينا كالملك في البيع وظنا كالانزجار في القصاص ومحتملا سواء كالانزجار في حد الخمر أو مرجوحا كالتوالد في النكاح الآيسة. Okay, achieving the goal, he says rahimahullah, achieving the goal of the Sharia ruling could be based on certainty, like ownership in transactions. what is the reason behind transacting? If I buy you this, if I sell you this and then you buy it, well, what is achieved by that is a tamlik, is ownership. That is a necessary part of the transaction. If I sold you this pen, took your money, took $5 from you, and then tomorrow I went and I took it back from you, then I have violated the basic understanding of the transaction, which is a tamlik, ownership. What is the basic understanding of the marriage contract? It was the permissibility to engage in sexual intercourse and then to have the children being ascribed to both of the parents. And implied in that is the protection of the woman and her rights. So oftentimes when we engage in a transaction, we forget that there is just a basic right that is underpinning that. So that he is talking about this is achieving the goal of the Sharia. In this case, it's a certainty. Or it could be partial, such as scaring others in punishments of retaliation, al-qisas. So why is the qisas punishment, the retaliatory punishment in the qisas, why is that permissible? One of the reasons, see, I'm saying one of the reasons, meaning it's partial, is to scare people, to prevent them from engaging in this. And I think I might have mentioned this when we talked about crimes and punishment in the fiqh class. I can't remember, but one of the philosophies of law in general, this is now a universal principle, is that there's a concept that punishments should be large enough or big enough to be scary, basically scary enough to ward off people. Now, that's a reason, but it's not 100% ironclad, because sometimes people still do things, and that's why he said it's a partial. So achieving the goal of the Sharia could be based on certainty, like ownership in transactions, or partial, such as scaring others through retaliation punishments, or it can be between the two options, like scaring others in punishments of alcohol. So either that, we can argue that that's a certainty, or that's something that's partial. I see that I'm running out of time, so rather than dig into the hashia, let me pick this up in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so just to review, we are saying that achieving the goal of the Sharia ruling could be based on certainty, like ownership in the transactions, or partial, such as scaring others in retaliation, or it can be between the two options, like scaring others in the punishment of alcohol. So there's a hadd punishment, which is the goal of the Sharia, and at the same time the goal of the Sharia in that hadd punishment is to ward off people. And then he says, or preferring one of these, like an older lady marrying and having children. So most likely an older lady, when she gets married, will not have children, but she could have children. So we're not going to say necessarily that the goal is al-injab is to have children, but it could be the case. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَالْأَصَحُ جَوَازُ التَّعْلِيلِ بِالْآخِرِيَيْنِ. And the dominant opinion is that you can do ta'leel, you can establish the ratio legis with the latter two. فإن فات قطعا فالأصح يعتبر سواء ما فيه تعبد كاستبراء أمة اشتراها بائعها في المجلس وما لا كحلوق نسب ولد المغربية بالمشرقية. If the goals of the Sharia in a particular act have not been achieved, the majority opinion is that the act is not to be considered, whether in cases of worship, such as leaving time for a slave woman's womb to be clear if one buys her, as well as acts not of worship, like a case of lineage between an Easterner and a Westerner. Okay, so here we're dealing with the following issue. What happens if the goal of the Sharia, which we just said there are different types and we can establish that the goal of the Sharia has not been met? Do we consider the ruling in acts of worship and not in acts of worship or not? We do not consider it. The Ahnaf, they do. And let me give you the examples that he gives because they're very good examples. Istibra' al-Rahim, or leaving time for a woman's womb to be clean or to be, separated from the previous relationship. He says, buying a slave woman's womb to clear the rahim if one buys her. Meaning, this is a translation, so obviously I'm dropping some things from the Hashia. The situation is as follows: a man has a slave girl, and again I apologize for the slave example, who he had just purchased legally, has not approached her sexually, and then in the same moment sells her to somebody else, and then the person buys her. Now the question is, do you have to do the istibra' al-rahim? Does she have to wait the waiting period before the new owner can engage in sexual intercourse or not? The majority opinions say no, because we know for certain that she has not been approached sexually, so there's no point of carrying that out. And it's an act of worship. Istibra' al-rahim is an act of worship. It's not something that is rationally based. It's something that we do out of worship. Imam Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu says that you have to do that because it's an act of worship. Another example that he gives is in cases of lineage between an Easterner and a Westerner. So let's say somebody from the East contracts a marriage with a woman in the West, and we know for certain that they have not met. She journeys to meet him, and when she comes, she is with child or has a child. So we say, well, okay, obviously this is an illicit child out of wedlock because, we know that they didn't meet. But again, Imam Abu Hanifa says, no, we will connect the lineage. Now, in the latter example, you can see how in real world examples, we might want to give the fatwa or give a ruling in a court based on the position of Abu Hanifa because it's going to preserve the lineage. So even though we're talking about theoretical fiqh in all of our classes, as I always say, we have to remember that it's a practical application. Again, this is an issue of if the goals of the Sharia, which is why we have to know what the goal is, what the illah is, why do we have the illah? If the goal of the Sharia is not established, the majority opinion says then we do not use it. It's not to be considered. Okay. وَالْمُنَاسِبُ ضَرُورِيٌّ فَحَاجِيٌّ فَتَحْسِينِيٌّ. Appropriateness is either obligatory, a need, or an extra. And these are very important that we understand because it's a fundamental part of the way our legal tradition works. وَالضَّرُورِيُّ حِفْظُ الدِّينِ فَالنَّفْسِ فَالْعَقْلِ فَالنَّسَبِ فَالْمَالِ فَالْعِرْضِ وَمِثْلُهُ مُكَمِّلُهُ كَالْحَدِّ بِقَلِيلِ الْمُسْكِرِ. Obligatory are, and these are the maqasid of the Sharia. He lists 6, but he even says in the commentary he just added 1, but we know them as the 5. Protection of religion, life, intellect, lineage, wealth, and honor. Honor is usually understood to be lineage. Likewise, obligatory are things that lead to them, such as the hadd punishment in drinking a little alcohol. So, these are known as the maqasid of the Sharia or the kulliyat of the Sharia, that the Sharia in all of its rulings, in its most macro level, is here to preserve and to protect the following 5. The protection of religion, deen, and therefore anything that prevents somebody's freedom of practicing faith. Again, in the books they will mention that it's Islam, but when you get into the literature of maqasid al-Sharia, it's all just people have faith, can practice their faith in general. We have the concept of coexistence with Ahlul Kitab and whatnot. La ikrah fi din, etc. That means anything that prevents that, we are allowed to ward off. Protection of life and nafs, so anything that could potentially harm life, like public health situations, we have obligation to ward that off. Protect lineage, in the last example with Imam Abu Hanifa dissenting, we gave it, and that's an example. Wealth intellect. So anything that harms the intellect, we need to ward off, and wealth and ownership. And then he adds honor, which is maybe you can think of like basic human rights. Likewise, he says, obligatory are the things that lead to them, such as the hadd punishment in drinking a little bit of alcohol. Why is there a hadd punishment? because what's the problem with alcohol as it relates to these maqasid is that we have an obligation. It is necessary to protect the intellect. So therefore, anything that could harm the intellect, we have sometimes punishments and torts that protect us from that. والحاجي كالبيع فالإجارة وقد يكون ضروريا كالإجارة لتربية الطفل ومكمله كخيار البيع. And then the next level is we have the needs, which are not in and of themselves obligatory, like the obligatory ones, but sometimes they can be. So he says the needs like buying, selling, and renting. So you don't have to buy, sell, and rent. It's to live. To live, you just need to eat and survive. And these can also be necessary, such as renting a space for a child to learn. Likewise, issues joining to needs like the option to rescind in a transaction. So, okay, while buying and selling as independent concepts are not obligatory, they could be obligatory when they're connected to something which is greater, like you need a place to raise your children. So in that case, that need becomes obligatory. And al-khiyar, the option to rescind in a transaction. But at-tamlik or al-mulk or al-milkiyya, ownership, is one of the maqasid of the sharia. So therefore, a byproduct of that is in the transactions of buying and selling, which is the vehicle, the instrument that we use to own things. There has to be an opportunity to rescind. So while in and of itself rescinding, the option to rescind in the transaction, al-khiyar, is itself independently, philosophically, not obligatory, because it's linked to something that is obligatory, it becomes a need that is raised to the level of obligatory. And then he says, وَالتَّحْسِينِي مُعَارِضٌ لِلْقَوَاعِدِ كَالْكِتَابَةِ وغيره كسلب العبد أهلية الشهادة. Then the extras, what go against legal principles, like buying one's freedom, al-mukatab, and what does not go against legal principles, like a slave not being able to bear witness. So I want to explain them. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to start and pick up in the next clip. Al-mukataba, so a slave being able to buy their freedom, while it's meritorious that a slave owner does that because all of the Sharia pushes for the manumission of slaves, and again, I apologize for the slave example, it's not something that's a need or obligatory, and you don't have to do that. I am running out of time. Let me pick up this discussion in the next clip to do it justice, inshallah. Okay, so just to backtrack for a second, we're talking now about the extra. We talked about obligatories and the needs, so the appropriateness can be obligatory or it could be need-based. Now we're talking about the extras, the tahsiniyat, and he says the extras, what go against legal principles, like buying one's freedom, al-mukataba. So the legal principle is that it's meritorious, ethically meritorious, fakku raqaba, to free a slave. And many of the expiations are to free a slave. And when you analyze the fiqh of slavery in Islam, you will see that it is a system of law that has strangulated the practice of slavery that eventually leads to its eradication. Not that it is a way to increase slavery. That's the Western model of slavery, what is called chattel slavery, chattle, chattel slavery, which unfortunately, when we talk about slavery in the modern world and in the English language, most people's minds, even Muslims, that's what they assume. The slavery of the Sharia is something completely different. Not complete. I don't want to exaggerate. Not completely different, but it's quite different. And anyway, his point is that while it's a meritorious thing, it's a principle of law. It's not something that is. It's just an extra thing if somebody wants to free a slave. Also related to the extras is what does not go against a legal principle, such as a slave not being able to bear witness. A slave can do riwayah, can narrate, but cannot bear witness because of the deficiency of freedom from their state. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد. Okay. ثم المناسب إن اعتبر عينه في عين الحكم بنص أو إجماع فالمؤثر أو بترتيب الحكم على وفقه. Okay, there are 4 types of appropriateness. So in the previous section, we talked about there are 3 types of appropriateness is either obligatory, need, or extra. Now we're going to talk about the types of appropriateness. There are 4, and the Arabics is al-mu'thir, that which has effect, al-mula'im, that which is related, al-gharib, that which is odd or obscure, and al-mursal. So the first one, al-mu'thir, which I read, is if the ratio legis is in the ruling through a clear text or consensus, a nas or ijma', or if the ruling is known to have this ratio legis even if not explicitly mentioned. Like the hadith in Abu Dawood radiallahu anhu, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man massa dhakarahu falyatawadda," the person who touches their private parts, meaning with their open hands, like when you remember in fiqh class we went like this, that which is touching each other, that's what, if you touch your private parts with that, it breaks your wudu. If you touch your private parts with that, it does not break your wudu. So therefore we know that the illah is touching your private parts. Accidentally or not accidentally, with shahwa or not with shahwa, that doesn't matter. It's just the act of touching is one of the things that causes us to break our wudu. So that's a clear text. فإن اعتبر العين في الجنس أو عكسه أو الجنس في الجنس فالملائم وإلا في الغريب. It is ملائم, the appropriateness is related, ملائم, when the ratio legis is found in the ruling types or opposites or a type within a type. If not, then it's the third category called al-gharib. So, like the permissibility of combining the prayers not while traveling if there's inclement weather. I know that the text of the hadith and the sharia is fil matar, which is rain, but really what is meant by that text is inclement weather, because that was the inclement weather at the time. But if you live in the West or in Europe or other parts of the world, there's all types of inclement. I mean, we have hailstorms sometimes, which are really nasty. Sometimes a hail can be like a piece of ice, can be like this big falling from that. It's very inclement weather. Tornadoes, hurricanes, snowstorms, sandstorms. So if you have a sandstorm in the Middle East, I mean, I've witnessed and seen sandstorms in Egypt many times. I mean, it's pretty bad. That's will fall under this. So I like to translate it as inclement weather so people understand. Anyway, you can't combine your prayers normally. Even though in the Shafi'i method we have the dispensation to do taking the hadith of Ibn Abbas in Sahih Muslim, but let's just put that aside to a second. In general, we don't combine our prayers, but in this case, you can combine your prayer when it rains, so it's related to the combining the prayer when you travel. Obviously, you can't shorten the prayer unless you travel. This is a different issue. So, what is the thing that is related? Al-haraj, difficulty. And we said before, part of what we understand from traveling is that it's difficulty. Now, if it's not A or B, if it's not mu'thir or mu'alim, then it's gharib. And that's an extra thing that Shaykh al-Islam added. وإن لم يعتبر فإن دل دليل على إلغائه فلا يعلل به وإلا فالمرسل ورده الأكثر. So he says, if one cannot establish any of this, and there is no proof for establishing a ratio legis, then one cannot use it as proof. If not, it is called mursal, and most scholars reject this. So let me explain that. The example that he gives is often is a slave owner who engages in sexual intercourse with his, let's just say it's a male slave owner, of course, who engages with sexual intercourse with his female slave in the day in Ramadan. So what's the expiation for that act? Well, we know the default expiation is you have to free a slave. Or if you can't, then you fast the 2 months. If you can't, then you feed. Okay, well, one would say, well, it's kind of like easy for him to free the slave because it's his own, to free a slave because he just committed that act with that slave. So some people, and this is a famous fatwa from one of the Maliki madhabs, that a ruler in Al-Maghrib used to do that, and his fatwa is for you, your expiation is that you have to feed people because it's harder, because the point of the Sharia is to make the expiation difficult, not that you can buy your way out of it. But in the default ruling, he's saying, well, if you cannot establish, there's no really proof for that, other than the fatwa, which is a unique situation. In the case of a slave owner who has sexual intercourse with his female slave during the day in the month of Ramadan, it still follows that he has to free a slave. It could be, if that's his only slave, then he has to free her. If not, then we call it mursal, and most scholars reject this because there is no, really, they'll argue that it's not a clear type of link, but Imam Malik took it in his madhab. Okay. وليس منه مصلحة ضرورية كلية قطعية أو ظنية قريبة منها فهي حق قطعا والمناسب تنخرم بمفسدة تلزم راجحة أو مساوية لها في الأصح والمناسبة تنخرم بمفسدة تلزم راجحة أو مساوية لها في الأصح. Not considered of the mursal or maslaha, which is the common good. This is universal or absolute or partial near the legal issue, since in this case it's an absolute right. Appropriateness is violated with a corrupt act associated with it in the dominant opinion. Okay, so this last part about maslaha, one of the examples he gives is what Imam al-Ghazali argues, is if somebody's in battle. When I say in battle, I want you to think of a traditional classical pre-modern battle, because if you think about modern warfare, I mean, it's pretty much everything will be haram, but this is pre-modern warfare in which the enemy has captured some of your people and has used them as human shields, at tatarrus. Now, if you do not kill the enemy, they are going to kill more of you, but killing the enemy will kill your own people. In that case, and only in that case, this is the maslaha, the general good. It's obligatory, because if you don't do that and sacrifice your own people, more of your other people will die. But even Al-Ghazali says, but if like the enemy has captured your people, and this is his language, and taken them to a castle, that would be haram, because storming the castle, occupy the castle, is not obligatory. So in the first example, the obligatoriness in that moral act, and I pray that we never have to make a decision like that, is because you are saving the lives of people, which is hifadh al-nafs, which is necessary, because without killing the enemy, which would for certain would kill your own people that have been taken, for certain, yaqinan, your own people, more like thousands of your people will die. Masalan. I mean, it's a very wacky example, and as I said, in modern warfare, these really don't exist at all. But that's an example of maslaha, where the maslaha therefore can be universal, absolute, or partial. And the last thing that he says, just to wrap up so we don't run out of time, appropriateness is violated with a corrupt act associated with it in the dominant position. Okay, we'll leave it there. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's lecture we were able to take in its entirety number 5 in our list of the Masalik al-Illa, the pathways of the Illa, number 5, which is al-Munasaba, which is appropriability. We talked about how this is to identify and to articulate clearly as we can the ratio legis, and then when we do that in a certain way, then it becomes certain, but if we don't do that in a certain way, it becomes partial. We also talked about how related to this is understanding the goals of the Sharia, and how the goals of the Sharia, some of them are certain, and some of them can be like scaring others or preventing more harm, or between the two. We also learned that if in the dominant position, if the goals of the Sharia has not been achieved, whether an act of worship or an act of mu'amalat, of transaction, non-worship that is, it is not to be taken into consideration, with the notable dissent of the Hanafi madhab, and we gave 2 examples of that are from the book, and why in that case in real life we might even take the Hanafi opinion for its greater implications. Then we talked about appropriateness can either be obligatory, a need, or extra, and then how sometimes some of the needs can be lifted to the level of obligatory. Then we talked about the 4 types of appropriateness: the mu'thir, that which has effect; the mula'im, that which is related; the gharib, or that which is obscure. And then we also talked about the mursal, which is negated by most of the madhahib but taken by the madhab of Imam Malik radiyallahu anhu. And then we said, then we talked about maslaha, and afwan, the 4th kind is the mursal. We talked about that if the sorry, it's on another page. That if you can establish the ratio legis, then you cannot connect it to the proof. And we gave the example of a slave owner who has sexual intercourse with a slave girl during the days of Ramadan. And then we talked about maslaha, or the general good, and we talked about how it could be universal, absolute, and partial, using the example in battle, pre-modern battle that is, of Imam al-Ghazali to highlight the point. Okay, those are the main points, and inshallah we'll conclude all of this tomorrow's lecture. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.